Well, it's an opportunity to share with you and talk with you again, and I'm enjoying my series of studies now looking into the book of Hebrews. And if you are following this particular message and didn't hear the previous ones, then you should find somewhere, because I'm in the third chapter of Hebrews, and the first two chapters are extremely interesting and lead into this. And I would just simply say to you also that we'd like to keep in touch with you, and if you haven't given us your email address, we would appreciate your address so that we can pray for you and contact you. Right, now Hebrews chapter 3. Now, Paul, and I will repeat what I said in the previous messages, Paul is very clearly here not speaking so much to the church, but is referring to the Jewish people, the Hebrews. And yes, it does relate to the church, but you have to understand that most of the other epistles were more directed at the church. This one is very clearly written to his own Jewish people. And remember, Paul was a Jew, the very highest level, very high. Anyway, he starts off by saying, "Therefore, holy brothers, who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus." What a wonderful way to start. I would challenge you, fix your thoughts on Jesus. I mean, Jesus is the beginning, the ending. He's everything. I mean, to us as Christians, it's not religion, it's not faith, it's not just God. It's Jesus, the Son of God, who we know and relate to. And that's how he continues, because he says, Jesus, the apostle and high priest, whom we confess. That's quite interesting, because he's using the word apostle, which of course related to the apostles who were the senior leaders in the life of Jesus and in the early church. But he also refers to him as the high priest. Now, the high priest, of course, was very important in Jewish tradition and Jewish religion, because he was the one who stood between the people and God. And the significant thing is that when Jesus died on the cross, if you remember in the story, I'm sure you've read it, that simultaneously with the death of Jesus on the cross, nothing to do with the tomb, simultaneously with his death on the cross, it is said that the curtain or the veil in the temple, which separated between the people and where only the high priest could go behind the veil, that was torn into from top to bottom, not bottom up, from top to bottom. Very significant. God doing it from the top, man not doing it from the bottom. So what happened is this. It was so symbolic that Jesus was to become our high priest, in effect. So his position in ministry to us as Christians, as well as to the Jewish people, is he has replaced the high priest. And I'm using that word because, unfortunately, today too many religions employ priests, but Jesus is the priest, the high priest. And then he goes on in verse 2. Paul says, he, that's Jesus, was faithful to the one who appointed him. Now, I like this. By the way, I'm using, at the moment, I'm using the New International Version. I have to make this clear because I normally prefer the Authorized, but this is a New International Version. Somehow, I think he makes it get clearer. So he says that Jesus was faithful to the one who appointed him. So here we get a very clear illustration that Jesus was not just the Son of God, but was appointed to come to become high priest and to become an apostle being an ambassador, a messenger. So he was faithful as Moses was faithful in all of God's house. So the faithfulness of Jesus is likened to Moses' experience, because Moses, you know, he had a very unusual life. He lived 3 lives. I like to joke about this a bit because I will have lived 3 lives. He spent 40 years, he was rescued from the bulrushes by Pharaoh's daughter, spent his first 40 years in the king's palace. Then because he had an argument with one of the Egyptians and killed him, he was then banished to the wilderness, fled to the wilderness, and for 40 years he kept his father-in-law's sheep. That was his second life. First life in the palace, 40 years. Second life in the wilderness, 40 years. And when he was 80 years old, he met God. You know the story, the burning bush. And while he was out in the backside of the desert, he saw this bush, which was on fire, but wasn't destroyed. And God spoke to him. So he was to spend the next 40 years leading the people of Israel out of captivity in Egypt and leading them to the promised land. Now, I see a very, very strong similarity here with Jesus, because Jesus was called to, like Moses, take us from the world of sin, Egypt, through the years and bring us right to the point of the coming kingdom. It's very interesting. Just as the ministry of Moses, and by the way, he wasn't even allowed to enter the promised land, but for 40 years, he led the children of Israel through the wilderness. So in the likeness, the ministry of Jesus as an apostle and a high priest, let's not deal with the rest of his ministry, but his ministry as an apostle and a high priest is to bring us from the moment of salvation to the moment when we enter the kingdom. Right. And just as Moses was faithful, he did the job. Yeah, and it wasn't easy because the people, as we'll see in a moment, turned against him, grumbled, and they were always grumbling and complaining. So, yeah, I think sometimes, unfortunately, we're guilty of that, and we need to be careful that we don't grumble and complain. So, Jesus was faithful as Moses was, but then Paul goes on to put it into a slightly different context. He says that just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house, so for every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything.